She came home from 7 months overseas with medals on her chest and a clean record, a decorated Marine sergeant who had never once acted without cause. But one officer on a quiet highway decided she was a problem before he ever reached her window. What followed wasn't just a bad traffic stop. It was a cover-up, and it reached much further up the chain than anyone expected. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The courtroom was the kind of place that made people lower their voices without being asked. High ceilings, dark wood panels, rows of polished benches. Everything about it was designed to remind you that something serious was happening here. And on this particular Tuesday morning in late October, something serious most certainly was. The back rows had been claimed by reporters before 8 in the morning. They sat shoulder to shoulder with notebooks already open, phones silenced, but cameras ready. The public gallery was packed with ordinary people, neighbors, advocates, a few veterans in jackets with pins on the lapels, all of them present because word had gotten around. This wasn't going to be a routine hearing. At the defendant's table sat Sergeant Alana Brooks. She was 32 years old, black, with the kind of stillness that most people only pretended to have when they were nervous. She wasn't pretending. She sat straight-backed in her dress uniform, medals aligned across her chest, hands folded on the table in front of her like she was waiting for a briefing rather than a verdict. She didn't look around the room. She didn't whisper to her lawyer. She just sat there, eyes forward, jaw set, as calm as still water in a deep lake. Anyone paying attention could see the discipline in her, not the brittle kind that snaps under pressure, but something built over years of practice, something that had been tested in places that didn't show up on any civilian map. The medals on her chest weren't decorative, they meant something. Every person in that room sensed it, even if they couldn't name exactly what they were sensing. Her attorney, Ethan Cole, sat beside her, shuffling through a folder. He was in his mid-30s, decent-looking in a rumpled sort of way, with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He was a public defender, which meant he was underpaid and overworked. But he was sharp, sharper than the caseload he carried usually allowed him to show. He had been reviewing the same documents for 3 days running, and something about this case kept nagging at him in the quiet way that important things do when they haven't fully revealed themselves yet. The charge was assault on a law enforcement officer. The prosecutor, a composed man named Dennis Hartwell, laid it out cleanly for the court. His version was simple. On a stretch of highway outside the city, Sergeant Alana Brooks had allegedly assaulted Officer Daniel Hayes during a roadside traffic stop. According to Hayes, she had been uncooperative, aggressive, and had ultimately used physical force against him without provocation. Hartwell read the charge with the flat tone of someone who believed this was a straightforward matter. A formality. Really? The kind of case that resolved itself before lunch. What Hartwell did not account for, and what no one in the room could quite articulate yet, was the way Alana's presence complicated that simple story. You didn't look at this woman and think volatile. You didn't look at her and think aggressive. You looked at her and thought controlled, measured, the kind of person who chooses every single word before she speaks it. The courtroom doors swung open near the end of Hartwell's opening statement. Officer Daniel Hayes walked in. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, wearing his department uniform pressed to sharp creases. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never found it particularly necessary to question his own authority. He scanned the room as he moved toward his seat, nodding at 2 officers in the gallery, allowing himself a small smirk in the direction of a colleague near the aisle. He didn't look at Alana the way you'd look at someone who had allegedly hurt you. He looked at her the way you looked at a problem you'd already solved, with mild satisfaction, like the hard part was over and now it was just paperwork. He took his seat. The judge, the Honorable Frederick Barrow, was somewhere in his early 60s, gray-templed, deliberate, with a reputation for running a tight room. He had presided over more headline cases than he cared to remember, and the presence of reporters in his courtroom today had not improved his mood. He called the session to order and issued his first warning before anyone had said anything worth warning about. He reminded both parties that his courtroom was not a stage. He expected decorum. He expected professionalism. He expected everyone in this room to conduct themselves accordingly. The warning landed differently on different people. Ethan made a note in the margin of his folder. Hayes straightened in his seat with the tolerant expression of a man who felt the warning had nothing to do with him. Ethan had been quietly paying attention to the initial documentation for weeks now, and certain things were bothering him. The bodycam footage from Hayes' department-issued camera had not been submitted. The explanation given was a technical malfunction, a common enough occurrence, frustrating but not unprecedented. Except that when Ethan dug a little, he couldn't find a maintenance log for the malfunction. He couldn't find a replacement record. The camera had simply, according to the department, he failed to record. Ethan had noted this and said nothing about it yet. He was waiting. The witness statements were also thin. There had been other vehicles on that stretch of road. 2 of them had been identified, their drivers briefly interviewed, and then those statements had somehow not made it into the submission package. Again, the explanation was administrative. Again, Ethan found the explanation unsatisfying. Hayes's account, as Hartwell presented it, had a quality that Ethan recognized from years of reading police reports. It was too neat. Real encounters between people had jagged edges, hesitations, contradictions, moments where things didn't quite line up because human beings didn't behave consistently even in genuine emergencies. Hayes's account had none of that. Every moment followed the next with perfect logical order, as if the whole thing had been assembled from a template rather than remembered from life. Ethan kept these thoughts to himself. He wrote a small question mark next to the timeline Hartwell was presenting and turned the page. The morning session moved through preliminary motions, evidentiary standards, a discussion about chain of custody, standard procedural territory that most of the gallery found dull but endured out of dedication. The reporters made notes anyway, banking material for later. Somewhere around 11 in the morning, the temperature in the room began to change. It was Hayes who started it. During a break in proceedings, the judge had called a brief recess while a filing was located. Hayes moved to his seat with the easy comfort of a man on his own turf. As he passed the defendant's table, close enough that people nearby could hear, he said something low and dismissive. Not loud enough to be quoted, loud enough for Alana to hear. Alana did not react. She looked straight ahead. Hayes settled into his seat, said something quieter to the officer beside him, and they both smiled. The judge returned. Proceedings resumed, but the dynamic had shifted. There was something ugly circulating through the room now, a kind of low pressure that hadn't been present in the morning. Ethan sensed it. A few reporters glanced at each other. 2 veterans in the gallery leaned together briefly, and then apart. Alana continued to sit straight-backed, hands folded, face forward. Then the moment no one would forget arrived without ceremony. During a heated procedural exchange, the judge had asked Hayes to clarify a point in his written statement, and Hayes had begun responding with more confidence than the question required. Hayes moved. He stepped forward, half out of his seat, making some gesture of emphasis toward Alana's direction, and then his hand came across, fast, open-palmed. The sound of it landing against Alana's face cracked through the courtroom like a branch snapping in cold air. The room stopped. Not slowly, all at once, as if someone had cut the power. Mouths open, eyes wide. A reporter in the back dropped her pen. The stenographer's fingers froze above her keyboard. Judge Barrow's hand, reaching for his gavel, paused mid-motion. Hayes had slapped a United States Marine across the face in open court. For 1 full second, Alana did not move. She sat with her head slightly turned from the impact, eyes cast to the side. Something moved through her face, not rage. Not grief, not shock. Something more fundamental. The thing that lives below emotion, the thing that has been trained and conditioned and called upon in the dark, in the field, in the moments that don't make it into any report. Then she moved. It wasn't a swing. It wasn't wild. It was a pivot, a single clean rotation of her upper body, weight shifting through her core, and her right fist followed that weight in a line so direct it seemed geometric. The punch connected with Hayes' jaw with a sound that was entirely different from the slap, deeper, more final. Hayes went down, not stumbling, not catching himself on a chair. He went straight down and hit the floor like something that had stopped being a person mid-fall and become simply an object subject to gravity. Silence. Then the room came apart. Officers surged forward from the gallery. Someone shouted. The judge found his gavel and slammed it 3 times, 4 times, the sound swallowed by the noise rising from every corner of the room. Reporters were on their feet. Someone was already on a phone. 2 officers bent over Hayes on the floor, checking his jaw, checking his breathing, looking up with expressions that couldn't quite settle on an emotion. Other officers moved toward Alana and stopped. Because Alana was sitting back in her chair, hands folded on the table, in exactly the position she had maintained all morning. She had not risen. She had not looked around the room. She was simply sitting there, straight-backed, as if she were waiting for the noise to finish so the proceeding could continue. That was what people would talk about afterward, but not the punch, or not only the punch. The image that burned itself into memory was that. A woman sitting calmly in her chair while the courtroom dissolved into chaos around her, like a person who had done only what needed doing and had no particular feelings about it either way. Judge Barrow got control of the room eventually. His voice cut through the noise with the authority of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and had very little patience left for theater. Hayes was removed from the immediate area. Medical attention was called. Alana was asked to remain seated, as if she had any intention of doing otherwise. Within 2 hours of the hearing suspension, footage from the courtroom was circulating online. 3 different angles, shot by 3 different phones in the gallery before security got organized. And the slap was visible in all of them. So was the punch. So was Alana, sitting back down with the composure of someone who had simply completed a necessary task. The headlines split almost immediately. Some of them called her dangerous. Some of them called her a hero. Some of them asked the more uncomfortable question, how had a police officer walked into a courtroom and struck a decorated military veteran across the face in front of a judge? And what did it mean that the story was somehow about her reaction rather than his action? That question, uncomfortable and unresolved, was the one that would drive everything that followed. To understand what happened inside that courtroom, you have to go back to the night it all started. Back 3 months to a stretch of state highway outside the city, somewhere around 11:30 on a Thursday evening in late July. Alana had landed stateside 2 days earlier after a 7-month deployment. She'd cleared her out processing, spent 1 night at a hotel near the base, and then pointed her car toward home. She wasn't in a hurry. She had a full tank of gas, a cold bottle of water in the cup holder, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has spent 7 months in a place where quiet was a luxury. She was just driving, staying in her lane, doing nothing. The flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror around 11:45. She checked her speedometer first. She'd been doing a careful 62 on a 65 highway. She checked her mirrors and found nothing that explained the stop. No expired registration tag she'd forgotten. No equipment issue. She pulled smoothly to the shoulder the way she'd been taught to do as a teenager. Signal on, gradual deceleration, full stop, both hands visible on the wheel before the engine was even off. Officer Daniel Hayes got out of his cruiser and walked toward her car with a walk that communicated something before he even opened his mouth. It was the walk of a man who had already made a decision. His posture said she was a problem and he was the solution, and the only thing left was to process the paperwork. He reached her window and looked in. license and registration. No greeting, no good evening, no explanation for the stop. Alana was already reaching for the glove compartment with her right hand, her left still visible on the wheel, moving the exact way they teach you to move when you've been pulled over, slow and visible and narrated. "I'm reaching into the glove compartment for my registration," she said, the same way she would have stated her position to a superior officer, clear, informational. "Slow down," Hayes said, as if she had been moving quickly. "Yes, sir." She produced her license and registration and held them out the window. He took them without looking at her, went back to his cruiser. She watched the clock on her dashboard while he ran the plates. 7 minutes passed. Everything came back clean. It always did. When Hayes returned, he handed the documents back and stood there for a moment, looking at her car, at the back seat, at the empty roads beyond. "Where are you coming from?" "Fort Drummond Regional Base," she said. "I just got back from overseas." He looked at her. "You deployed?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the back seat again. "Oh, what branch?" "Marine Corps." Something passed across his face. It wasn't quite disbelief. It was something narrower than that. A recalibration, like a man whose mental picture didn't match what was sitting in front of him and who had chosen to trust the picture over the evidence. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Alana's training didn't allow for visible reaction in moments like this. She filed every flag being raised internally: the unfounded stop, the long pause, the order to exit without explanation, and she complied, the same way she'd been trained to follow procedures in situations where the variables didn't add up. She got out of the car, stood on the shoulder, hands at her sides, visible. Hayes circled the vehicle. He looked at the tires. He peered in the passenger window, till he came around the front and stood closer than he needed to stand. Across the road, partially hidden by the shadow of a transport truck pulled into a rest area, a rideshare driver named Marcus Reed was waiting out a long gap between fares by scrolling through his phone. He'd watched the lights go on and had looked up the way people do when they're bored and something moves, without any real intention. Then he'd watched Hayes get out of the cruiser, and something about the walk, something about the angle of the interaction, made Marcus put his phone face down in his lap and start recording instead. He wasn't sure why. He couldn't have explained it clearly. It just felt like the kind of moment that needed a witness. Back on the shoulder, Hayes had moved into a new phase of the stop. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with a traffic violation. Where was she going exactly? Who was she visiting? Had she been drinking? Was there anything in the vehicle she needed to tell him about? Each question was phrased with the casual tone of someone who already suspected the answer, already knew you were lying, and was simply waiting for you to incriminate yourself. Alana answered each question with the same even tone. No, she hadn't been drinking. She was going to her mother's house in the city. There was nothing in the vehicle. She had already told him she was a returning Marine. There was no reason she could identify for this stop. That last sentence, said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact, was what Hayes had been waiting for. "I determined the reason for the stop," he said. "Yes, sir." "May I understand that?" She kept her hand still. Her voice was the same. "I'm simply noting that I was not speeding, and my vehicle and license are in order." "You're being uncooperative." "I've answered every question you've asked me, sir." His hand dropped to his belt, not to his weapon, but close enough to it that the proximity was the point. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Alana went still for a half-second. She looked at him, not with defiance, with the precise, calibrated attention of a person assessing a situation and calculating the correct response. Then she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. Hayes stepped close. He wasn't reading her rights. He wasn't citing a charge. He just positioned himself like a man who needed to establish, physically, it where the boundary of his authority ended and hers began. "You have an attitude," he said, "I haven't raised my voice once, sir." "That's your problem. You got something to say. Say it straight." Alana said nothing. He grabbed her by the left arm, not to cuff her, not to restrain her in any procedural sense, but in the gripping way of a man who wanted to feel the physical reality of control. His hand closed hard above her elbow, and he pulled her arm back at an angle that had nothing to do with any standard detainment procedure. "Remove your hand, please." Her voice was low and flat, not a request. A warning delivered in the register of someone who understood exactly what happened when warnings were ignored. He did not remove his hand. He pulled harder, using his weight to torque her arm backward. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Alana's body responded the way a body responds when it has been trained for thousands of hours to react to a specific kind of physical threat. She did not think about it. She did not decide. Her left arm broke the grip, a turn, a pull, a precise application of leverage that released her without striking him. And she stepped back, putting distance between them, hands raised and open, the universal signal that she was not escalating. "Don't touch me," she said. Hayes stumbled back from the release. He hadn't expected strength or precision. He'd expected compliance, or panic, or enough resistance to justify what came next. What he got instead was a woman standing 2 feet away from him with her hands up, chin level, breathing controlled. Looking at him with an expression that required no translation. He landed on the ground, not from a blow, but from the sudden absence of the resistance he'd been leaning against. When you put all your weight into pulling something and that something lets go, physics does the rest. He looked up at her from the shoulder of the road, and then he made his decision. Within 3 minutes, a second cruiser had pulled up behind his. 2 more officers got out. They arrived to find Hayes on the ground and Alana standing with her hands visible, and they processed the scene the way they had been conditioned to process it, through the lens of what they saw, rather than how it had arrived. Hayes pulled himself up. He was already talking before anyone asked him anything. His hands came up, describing something. His voice was controlled and authoritative. By the time the other officers were fully briefed, they had a version of events. That version had nothing to do with an unjustified stop, a pattern of harassment, or an officer using his weight to physically torque the arm of a woman who had done nothing wrong. It had to do with a suspect who resisted a routine detention, an officer who responded, a situation that required escalation. Alana was cuffed without ceremony. She did not resist. She stated clearly that she wanted to speak to a lawyer and then said nothing else. As they put her in the back of the second cruiser, she looked through the window at the transport truck across the road. Marcus Reed's phone light had gone dark. He had stopped recording. He sat very still in his driver's seat, watching the scene on the shoulder of the road. And he thought about whether to get out of his car and say something. He thought about what that might mean for him. He thought about the woman being put in the cruiser. He thought about all of it for a long time after the police cars pulled away, until there was nothing left on the road but the dust they'd raised and the sound of his own breathing. He didn't say anything that night, but he didn't delete the footage either. Alana was processed at the county jail sometime around 2 in the morning. She sat in the holding cell with her back against the cinder block wall, arms resting on her knees, and she thought through every decision she had made on that road shoulder. She couldn't find the wrong one. That was the part that settled into her like something cold, not the arrest itself, but the certainty underneath it. She had done everything right. She had followed every protocol. She had given Hayes every opportunity to step back from the edge, and she was still in a cell. And he was going home. She had fought in places where the rules of engagement were a matter of life or death. She had followed those rules even when they cost her. She had come home from all of that to this, a stretch of highway she had every right to drive on, a man who had decided she didn't belong on it, and a system already building its walls around him. She asked for a phone call, called her sister, and said 4 things. She was okay. She hadn't hurt anyone. She needed a lawyer, and she needed her mother to know she was back stateside. Then she sat back down and waited for morning. Back on the road, Hayes was filing his report at the precinct. He wrote calmly, deliberately, are in the flat procedural language that police reports use, language designed to convey objectivity while doing the opposite. He described a routine stop. He described escalating behavior. He described physical resistance. He described a defensive response. He did not describe the grip. He did not describe the angle. He did not describe the 7 minutes in his cruiser while he made up his mind about who she was. He read through the report once, found it satisfactory, and submitted it. He had every reason to believe it was over. The morning after the courtroom incident, Ethan Cole was at his desk before 7. He hadn't slept particularly well. He'd spent most of the night watching the footage already circulating across every platform. 3 angles, all grainy, all unmistakable. The slap, the pause, the punch, the stillness afterward. He'd watched it 7 or 8 times, not because he needed to, but because something about the way Alana had sat back down unsettled him in a way he couldn't yet name. It wasn't the punch that stayed with him. It was the composure. He pushed his coffee aside and pulled the case file toward him. The bodycam footage was still listed as unavailable due to a technical malfunction. That phrase, technical malfunction, was doing a great deal of work in this file, and Ethan had decided he was no longer willing to let it. He picked up the phone and called the department's evidence liaison. He was told the matter was being looked into. He asked who specifically was looking into it. He was told he'd receive documentation in due course. He hung up and made a note. No name given, no timeline provided, no logging number for the inquiry. Then he started on Hayes' history. Public defenders didn't always have the resources to dig deep on opposing witnesses, but Ethan had a gift for finding things in places other people stopped looking. He spent the morning going through complaint logs, cross-referencing incident reports, and pulling every public-facing record tied to Hayes' name across 8 years on the force. What he found wasn't explosive, nothing that would have ended a career on its own, but it formed a shape: aggression complaints. 4 of them over 8 years, none sustained. A use-of-force incident from 3 years ago that had been internally reviewed and closed without disciplinary action. 2 complaints from civilians describing stops that felt racially motivated, both withdrawn before they formally entered the system. Withdrawn, not dismissed. There was a difference. Complaints got dismissed when they lacked merit. They got withdrawn when someone had a conversation with the person who filed them. Ethan circled those 2. He made a note underneath. Who spoke to the complainants? He didn't have the answer yet, but the question was now on paper, which meant it was no longer just a feeling. By midday, Ethan had shifted to the night of the roadside stop. He pulled up a satellite map of the highway stretch and located the rest area on the opposite side of the road, wide enough for a transport vehicle, direct sightline to the shoulder where Hayes had stopped Alana. If someone had been parked there, they would have had an unobstructed view of the entire interaction from roughly 40 meters away. Far enough to be outside Hayes' immediate awareness. Close enough to see faces in headlight glare. Nothing in the submission package mentioned a civilian witness. But the stop had happened on a state highway, not a back road, and the rest area directly across had active parking that night. The idea that no one had seen anything was its own kind of implausibility. Ethan made another note. The file was starting to look less like a defense case and more like an excavation. Across town, in the waiting room of a county services office, where she was meeting with a victim's advocate on an unrelated matter, Alana sat in a plastic chair and read a news article about herself on her phone. The headline called her a volatile ex-military suspect. The article described her punch as an unprovoked attack. It quoted a police union spokesperson who said the incident raised serious concerns about the mental fitness of returning veterans in civilian settings. She read it twice, then she put her phone away. She had known this was coming. It wasn't the first time she'd had to sit still while someone described her as something she wasn't. She'd done it in the field, in briefings where the intelligence was wrong and she had to wait for the right moment to correct it rather than the emotionally satisfying one. She had learned a long time ago that timing was everything. You didn't fight every battle the moment it presented itself. You fought it when you had the ground for it. What she felt, sitting in that plastic chair under fluorescent light, wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more durable. A kind of resolve that had no particular expression and didn't need one. She thought about the oath she'd taken when she was 23. Not what the words said, but what they had meant to her then and what they still meant now. She thought about her mother, who had pressed her uniform the morning of her first deployment and said nothing except come home. She had come home, and this was what she'd come home to. The advocate called her name, and she stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked in without looking back at the phone in her pocket. That same afternoon, 3 states away, Colonel Victor Ramsey sat in his office on base and watched the courtroom footage on his laptop. He was 57, built like a man who stayed in shape for reasons of principle rather than appearance, with close-cropped gray at his temples. He watched the footage without expression, without sound. He'd muted it after the first 30 seconds because he didn't need the commentary. He had known Alana Brooks for 4 years. He had commanded her unit on their second deployment together, and he had read every evaluation she'd ever received, good and mediocre alike. He knew her capability, and he knew her character, and he understood, with the immediate clarity of a man who had spent 30 years reading people under pressure, exactly what the footage showed and exactly what it didn't. He didn't make any calls that day. He didn't reach out to anyone in the media or the legal system. That wasn't how he operated. He closed the laptop, sat back, and began thinking carefully about what channels existed and which of them were appropriate. He would not interfere with the legal process. But he would make sure the legal process had what it needed to function correctly. 3 days passed. The media noise grew louder and then began fragmenting into competing narratives, the way it always did once a story became bigger than its original facts. A veterans advocacy group issued a statement supporting Alana. The police union issued a counter-statement. A legal commentator spent 6 minutes on national television explaining why the case was complicated without explaining anything at all. And then Marcus Reed called Ethan's office. He called on a Thursday morning, almost exactly a week after the courtroom incident. The receptionist put him through without knowing who he was. Ethan picked up expecting an administrative call and instead heard a voice that was trying to sound more certain than it felt. "My name is Marcus Reed," the man said. "I was there. The night of the roadside stop. I was parked across the road." Ethan set down his pen very carefully. "How long were you there, Mr. Reed?" "Long enough." A pause. "I have footage." Ethan's voice didn't change register. Years of practice. "Can you come in?" "I need to know something first. I need to know if coming forward will make things worse for her or better." "Right now," Ethan said, "I'd say it has a real chance of making things better, but I can't promise you anything until I see what you have." Another silence. Then, "Okay, I can come in tomorrow." He arrived the next morning carrying his phone in his jacket pocket like it was something fragile. He was in his mid-30s, heavyset, all with the careful watchfulness of a man who spent a lot of time alone in a car thinking about things. He sat across from Ethan and placed the phone on the desk between them without being asked. The footage was 43 seconds long, shot from across the road in the dark, which meant the lighting was imperfect and the audio was almost entirely highway noise. But the image was clear enough. Hayes circling the car. Alana standing on the shoulder with her hands at her sides. Hayes moving in, the grab, visible, unmistakable. And then the release. Her movement so brief and controlled, it almost didn't register as movement at all. And Hayes going down. 43 seconds. Not everything, but enough. "Why didn't you come forward immediately?" Ethan asked, not as an accusation, as a genuine question. Marcus looked at the table. "I thought about it all night. I've had my own history with police. Nothing serious, but enough to know that getting involved wasn't something to do lightly." He paused, and then I watched what they were saying about her on the news, and I kept thinking, I have 43 seconds that says something different. How long can I sit on that? Ethan understood the calculation Marcus had made and understood why it had taken time. He also understood what the footage meant for the case, and he was already thinking several steps ahead. "The footage doesn't capture the full encounter," he said. "No, I started recording late. I almost didn't start at all." "But it shows the physical contact." "Yes." "And it shows her response to that contact." "Yes." Ethan sat back. "Mr. Reed, I want to be honest with you. I'm coming forward may attract attention, uncomfortable attention. I can't prevent that. What I can do is make sure your testimony is received correctly and that you have legal protection as a witness." Marcus looked at him steadily. "She didn't do anything wrong, did she?" It wasn't a question exactly. Ethan answered it anyway. "Based on what I've seen, no, she didn't." Marcus nodded once. "Then, let's do this right. The footage's existence didn't stay quiet for long. Within 48 hours of Marcus's visit, the knowledge that civilian footage existed, footage that appeared to contradict Hayes's account, had entered the media conversation through channels that Ethan couldn't fully trace and didn't try to. Not the footage itself, just the existence of it, the shape of what it might show. The effect was immediate and significant. Yet the police union issued a more defensive statement. Two legal commentators who had been confident in Hayes' version quietly revised their positions. Inside the department, an atmosphere shift began, not visible from the outside, but very real to anyone working within it. Officers who had been loudest in their public support of Hayes went noticeably quieter. Not dramatically, just quiet. Hayes did not go quiet. He pushed his legal team to accelerate the assault charges against Alana and began lobbying internally to exclude the civilian footage on chain of custody grounds. He was confident, decisive, and utterly certain that the situation remained under his control. But Ethan, watching from a measured distance, noticed something he'd learned to recognize over years of cross-examination. Hayes was performing calm. A true calm didn't require this much maintenance. The stakes had shifted. What had started as a courtroom assault case was becoming a question about what had happened on a highway shoulder 3 months ago. About who had told the truth and who had built a narrative. About whether a system that was supposed to produce justice could be counted on to do so when one of its own was on the wrong side of the line. Ethan had a partial answer to that question. He was working toward a complete one. And now, for the first time since this case had come to him, he felt the ground beneath it start to move. The courtroom was standing room only when proceedings reconvened 5 days later. The gallery that had been packed before was now overflowing into the side aisles. Additional seating had been requested and denied on procedural grounds. And outside the building, a camera line stretched along the public sidewalk, and a cluster of people stood on the courthouse steps holding signs that faced in two opposite directions, some in support of Alana, some in support of Hayes. Judge Barrow had issued a media conduct order that morning, which everyone acknowledged and most people immediately began reinterpreting to their own advantage. Inside, the atmosphere felt different from the first session. Things had solidified. People had taken positions in the days between, and those positions had hardened into a kind of certainty that made real listening difficult. The reporters were no longer there to see what happened. They were there to confirm what they already believed. The same was true of most of the gallery. But the only people in the room operating on genuinely open questions were Ethan, Alana, and Judge Barrow, and of those three, the judge was the most visibly displeased about the circumstances that had brought him here. Alana took her seat in the same way she always did, straight-backed, unhurried, hands settling onto the table with the ease of long habit. She was in her dress uniform again. She hadn't discussed this choice with Ethan. She'd simply arrived in it, and he had not asked, because the answer was clear. The uniform was not a costume or a strategy. It was a statement of fact. This is what I am. This is what I have given. Whatever you intend to say about me, you're saying it about this. Ethan had spent the past several days preparing a significant shift in how he approached the defense. When he had originally structured it around casting doubt on Hayes' account, standard procedure, measured and careful. That approach was still valid, but no longer sufficient. The footage had changed the terrain. He had something real now. Not everything, but enough to move from doubt to interrogation. Hartwell opened the session with a motion to limit consideration of Marcus Reed's footage on chain of custody grounds. His argument was technically sound and presented with clean precision. Ethan let him finish and then responded, not by attacking the legal argument directly, but by expanding the context surrounding it. He asked the court to consider why the department's own bodycam footage was unavailable. If civilian footage was being held to a rigorous chain of custody standard, that same standard should logically apply to the official evidence that had simply ceased to exist. He wanted to know whether a malfunction report had been filed, and if so, when and who had authorized it. Hartwell said the matter was under internal review. Ethan said he'd appreciate receiving the documentation on that review before the next session. Judge Barrow, who had been listening with the expression of a man doing careful arithmetic, told both parties to move forward. But he made a note. Ethan saw him make it, and that small motion of the judge's pen felt like the first crack of light under a door. Hayes took the stand mid-morning. He was composed. He had clearly prepared well. You could see it in how he arranged himself in the witness chair, in the measured spacing of his answers, and in the way he paused just long enough before responding to suggest thoughtfulness rather than rehearsal. His language was precise and departmental, each phrase calibrated to project authority without tipping into arrogance. Hartwell walked him through the roadside stop in logical, sequential order. Hayes described it exactly as his report had described it. Routine stop. Escalating behavior from the subject. Request to exit the vehicle. Growing resistance. An attempt to detain. Physical altercation. He used the standard vocabulary throughout. Subject, resistance escalation, defensive response. Words engineered to strip the human texture from what had happened and replace it with procedure. When Hartwell finished and Ethan rose for cross-examination, he did not begin with the stop. He began with the timeline. "Officer Hayes," he said, your report states that you initiated the stop at 23:47. Is that correct?" Hayes confirmed it was. "And you ran the license and registration before requesting Sergeant Brooks to exit the vehicle?" "Confirmed." "Your department's cruiser data log, submitted by the prosecution, shows a plate query at 23:48. The result came back clean at 23:55. That's a 7-minute gap. Can you tell the court what you were doing during those 7 minutes?" Hayes said he was reviewing the result and assessing the situation. 7 minutes, Ethan said, setting the number down quietly, like an object placed on a table. "And during your assessment, what specifically raised concerns about Sergeant Brooks?" Hayes described her demeanor, evasive, tense, unwilling to make steady eye contact. Ethan nodded. "She was reaching into the glove compartment for her registration when you first approached. Is that accurate?" "She was moving quickly in the vehicle. She verbally announced that she was reaching into the glove compartment before doing so. Is that statement in your report?" Hayes paused. "I don't believe I noted that specifically." "You don't believe you noted it," Ethan said carefully, "or you don't recall whether she said it?" Hayes said he didn't recall. Ethan let that sit for a moment before moving on. "When you ordered Sergeant Brooks out of the vehicle, Had she committed any observable infraction you can identify today? Hartwell objected on relevance. Judge Barrow sustained it, but gave Ethan a measured look that indicated the thread was being followed. Ethan shifted approach. Let's focus on the physical interaction. You've stated that Sergeant Brooks resisted your attempt to detain her. Can you describe for the court exactly how you were attempting to detain her at the moment the resistance occurred? Hayes said he placed a guiding hand on her arm to redirect her. A guiding hand, Ethan said. On which arm? Her left arm. And where on her left arm specifically? Hayes said above the elbow. And you described the purpose as redirecting her. Redirecting her toward what? Hayes said toward the vehicle. Your report indicates she was already standing at the driver's side of the vehicle when contact was initiated. Can you explain why redirection toward the vehicle was necessary if she was already beside it? A pause, longer than the coached ones had been. She was angling away, Hayes said, preparing to move. I see. Ethan made a small notation. When you placed your hand on her arm, did she verbally indicate that the contact was unwanted? Hayes said she had been agitated throughout the stop. That isn't what I asked, Officer Hayes. Did she verbally ask you to remove your hand? The courtroom had gone very still. Not the held-breath stillness of suspense, but something deeper. The stillness of people who sense that a question has been asked that requires a careful answer and who are watching to see whether the careful answer will be the true one. She made statements, Hayes said, choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man navigating a narrowing path. I interpreted them as continued resistance. What did she say? Hayes looked toward Hartwell for just a fraction of a second, a barely visible flicker, and then back. She told me to stop. The sentence entered the room and settled there. Ethan didn't underline it. He didn't look at the gallery. He simply moved forward, which was itself a form of emphasis, letting the words carry their own weight without theatrical punctuation. Marcus Reed took the stand in the early afternoon. He sat with the settled posture of a man who had made a difficult decision and arrived at a kind of peace with it. He described where he'd been parked, what drew his attention to the stop, why he'd begun recording. He was precise about what the footage showed and explicit about what it didn't, the imperfect lighting, the distance, the absence of audio. He didn't oversell it. Under cross-examination, Hartwell challenged his motivations, his delayed disclosure, and the fragmentary nature of the recording. Marcus acknowledged each point without defensiveness. Yes, he'd started recording late. Yes, he'd waited before coming forward, and he explained his reasons honestly, including his own uncertainty, his own fear, and the moment he had decided the footage was too important to keep sitting on his phone. That particular honesty, a man describing his own hesitation rather than presenting himself as a straightforward hero, landed in the courtroom with more weight than a polished account would have. The footage played on a screen visible to the entire room. 43 seconds of grainy highway night. Hayes circling the car. Alana standing still on the shoulder, hands visible and open. Hayes moving in close, the arm grab, the release. Hayes going down. Judge Barrow watched it without expression. He watched it a second time when Ethan requested the replay. Then he looked at Hayes, who sat at his table with the careful neutrality of a man who knew he was being watched and was working hard to control what was visible. Alana was called to the stand late in the afternoon. She walked to the witness chair the way she moved through all spaces, without hurry, without performance. She adjusted the microphone, settled into the seat, and looked out at the court with the clear, level expression that had characterized every moment of her presence in this building. She stated her name, rank, and years of service in the same even tone she used for everything. Ethan guided her through the night of the stop methodically. She described each moment in the sequence it had occurred, the flashing lights, the smooth stop, the license and registration. On the 7-minute wait in the cruiser, the order to exit, the questions that had no procedural grounding, the moment Hayes put his hand on her arm. When Officer Hayes made physical contact with your arm, Ethan said, "What did you do?" I asked him to remove his hand. Verbally? Yes, I said, "Remove your hand, please." Those were my exact words. And when he didn't comply? He increased the force he was applying. He was pulling my arm backward at an angle inconsistent with any standard detainment procedure I've been trained to recognize. I understand the difference between a controlling hold and an aggressive one. This was aggressive. What happened next? I applied a defensive release, a single movement designed to break the grip without causing injury. He hadn't anticipated it. And he lost his balance. Did you strike him? No. Did you intend to cause him harm? No. My intention was to stop the physical contact and create safe distance between us. After he fell, what did you do? I stepped back. I raised both hands, palms open. I stated clearly, "Don't touch me." And then I waited for backup to arrive. Ethan nodded. He let the answer rest. Sergeant Brooks, given your training, hand-to-hand combat, defensive tactics, years of high-pressure decision-making in the field, you had options available to you that most people don't have. Why did you choose the response you chose? Alana considered this for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it correctly. Decisive action doesn't always mean maximum force, she said. It means using exactly what the situation requires, nothing more. My objective was to stop being grabbed. I stopped being grabbed. That was sufficient. Hartwell's cross-examination was careful and competent, but it had a problem it couldn't resolve. Alana didn't break. She answered every question in the same measured tone. She corrected mischaracterizations without aggression. She acknowledged the limits of her own perspective without undermining the substance of her account. When Hartwell suggested that a trained combatant should have simply endured the contact and filed a complaint afterward, she looked at him with an expression that was thoughtful rather than combative and said, "Compliance isn't a universal principle. It's an appropriate response to legitimate authority." There was no legitimate authority being exercised in that moment. There was a man applying painful physical force to my arm without cause. Asking me why I didn't simply accept that is the wrong question. The room stayed quiet. Nobody wrote anything down. They were all just listening. When Alana stepped down from the stand, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that things shift when a truth is spoken clearly in a space built for it. The shape of the room had changed. The weight had moved. Hayes was watching from his table. His composure was still present, but thinner now. The quality of it had changed throughout the day. From the ease of a man who expected to win to the effort of a man working to look like a man who expected to win. There was a difference. He and anyone paying close attention could see it. The day's final development arrived near adjournment, without drama. Judge Barrow, holding a document that had been delivered to him during the late recess, addressed the court with the measured calm of a man who had learned not to give his reactions away in real time. He informed both parties that Internal Affairs had formally opened an inquiry into the conduct of Officer Daniel Hayes in relation to the events of the roadside stop. The inquiry would proceed parallel to the criminal proceedings. Additional documentation, if uncovered, would be subject to discovery. Hartwell absorbed this without visible reaction. Hayes' hands, resting on the table, went very still. Ethan made a note in the margin of his folder, a small one, unhurried. Court adjourned. Outside in the late afternoon, the camera line on the sidewalk swung toward Hayes as he emerged, and he put on his public face without hesitation. Measured, confident, the face of a man letting the process run its course. He gave no statement. He nodded to his attorney. He walked to his car with the stride of someone who was not going to let anyone see anything different from what he'd decided they would see. But that evening, somewhere in the quiet of his house after the noise of the day had finally stopped, Hayes sat with the one thought he had been pushing down since Marcus Reed's footage had played on that courtroom screen. Someone had been watching. Someone had recorded it. And despite everything he'd put in place, despite everything that was supposed to prevent exactly this from happening, the footage existed, the witness existed, the questions were being asked. The story he had built, so clean, so ordered, so perfectly sealed, had developed gaps he hadn't planned for. And somewhere in those gaps, if someone kept looking in the right places, there was something far more dangerous than 43 seconds of grainy highway footage. There was the truth of what he had done afterward, the decisions that came after the stop, the decisions that were supposed to stay invisible. He told himself, sitting alone in the quiet of his house, that it was still under control, that it could still be contained. But for the first time since the night on the highway, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. Court had barely adjourned before Ethan's phone buzzed. He was still gathering his folders from the defense table, still processing the weight of what the day had produced. Alana's testimony, Marcus's footage, the internal affairs announcement, when a message arrived from a number he didn't recognize. No name, no greeting, just 8 words. "We need to talk." Not on the phone. He looked at the message for a long moment, then slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and finished packing his bag. He told Alana he'd be in touch in the morning. He told himself to be careful about reading too much into an anonymous text. Then he went outside and stood on the courthouse steps in the cooling afternoon air and waited, because something in his gut said that was what the message was asking him to do. She appeared 12 minutes later. She was young, mid-20s at most, with the careful, slightly hunched posture of someone who had learned to take up less space in a room than she actually occupied. She wore a lanyard tucked inside her jacket, and she approached Ethan from the side, rather than head-on, like a person who had spent time thinking about sightlines. She stopped 2 feet away from him and spoke without looking directly at him, her voice low and level beneath the ambient noise of the street. Her name was Lena Park. She worked in the evidence unit of the police department, and the bodycam footage, she told him, had not malfunctioned. Ethan kept his face still. "Tell me what you mean by that." "I mean it was flagged," she said, "manually, after Hayes filed his report. The flag went in that same night. Within 2 hours of the incident report being submitted, it pulled the footage out of the standard evidence queue and moved it into a review hold." She paused. "Review holds don't delete footage. They just make it harder to access, harder to request, harder to notice. And then? And then it wasn't in the review hold anymore. Sometime in the 72 hours after that flag was entered, the footage was moved again. I don't know exactly where, but it didn't go to deletion. There's no deletion record. It went somewhere else." Ethan processed this. Someone moved it deliberately. Yes. Who authorized the initial flag? Lena looked at the middle distance. She was working through something. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the careful way she was breathing. "The flag was entered under a supervisor-level credential," she said. "I can't tell you whose from what I have access to. But it wasn't a technician. It wasn't a standard clerk. Someone with rank put that flag in." She left before he could ask anything else. She told him she'd be in touch and walked back the way she'd come, tucking her lanyard deeper inside her jacket as she went. Ethan stood on the steps and watched her disappear into the foot traffic and understood 2 things with equal clarity. First, that what she'd told him had just transformed the entire case, and second, that she was terrified and she'd come to him anyway, which meant he owed her every protection he could provide. He called his office from the car. He asked his paralegal to start pulling everything available on police department evidence handling protocols and supervisor-level access credentials. Then he drove home and sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and started drawing a timeline. Hayes filed his report at approximately 1 in the morning. The flag on the footage was entered at 2:47 a.m. Within 2 hours. Whoever had moved that footage had done it fast, before morning shift arrived, before anyone had a reason to look at it. That was not an accident. That was not an administrative oversight. That was a decision made quickly, in the middle of the night, by someone who understood exactly what the footage would show and exactly how much damage it could do. Ethan circled 2:47 a.m. and drew a line from it to Hayes' name. Then he drew a second line extending beyond Hayes to a question mark he hadn't yet filled in, but not for much longer. Inside the department, the Internal Affairs Inquiry was moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that IA investigations had when the investigators themselves were genuinely invested in the outcome. 2 detectives had been assigned, both from outside Hayes' division, which was standard protocol, and in this case also strategically deliberate. They began interviewing officers from Hayes' shift rotation. Most were cooperative in the narrow, careful way of people who had been told by their union representative to be cooperative in the narrow, careful way. A few were genuinely forthcoming. One officer, a woman named Sergeant Dana Briggs, who had worked alongside Hayes for 3 years, gave an interview that lasted 2 hours and covered considerably more ground than the investigators had expected. She didn't accuse Hayes of anything directly, but she described a pattern, a way of operating that she had noticed over time and had never found the right moment to formally raise. She described stops that didn't have clear cause. She described paperwork that sometimes seemed to have been constructed backward from a conclusion rather than forward from observations. She described a climate within the unit where certain things were understood to be left alone. The investigators thanked her and flagged her statement for further follow-up. On the 4th floor of the department building, in an office with a window that looked out over the parking structure, Captain Richard Lawson was having a different kind of day. He was a tall man in his early 50s, well-dressed even in uniform, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a career managing upward and protecting himself laterally. He had a reputation for competence and for loyalty. Loyalty to the right people, loyalty that was reciprocated. On paper, he was clean. In practice, he had become very good at keeping his fingerprints off of things that needed cleaning up. Hayes had called him from the roadside that night 3 months ago. Not from the scene, after from the precinct parking lot. The call had lasted 4 minutes. Lawson had listened, asked 2 questions, and made 2 calls of his own before he went to bed. He had believed, genuinely believed, that the matter was resolved, that the footage was buried deep enough, and the narrative was tight enough, and the system was reliable enough to hold. He had not anticipated Marcus Reed. He had not anticipated Ethan Cole being quite this persistent. And he had not anticipated Internal Affairs moving with this particular speed and this particular directness. And he sat at his desk and did what people in his position did when the walls started to move. He worked his phone. He called the union. He called a city councilman he had a long-standing relationship with. He called a former superior who owed him a significant favor and reminded him of it. He was managing. He was still managing. He had been in difficult positions before and had navigated out of them through careful, systematic pressure applied at the right points. But there was something different this time, and some part of him knew it even as he worked the phone. The other times, the difficulty had been contained. Internal, quiet, resolved before it became fully public. This time, a courtroom of reporters had already seen 43 seconds of highway footage. This time, a Marine sergeant's testimony had been broadcast on 3 cable channels. This time, the story was too large to be a story that stayed inside the building. He hung up from his last call and sat very still for a moment, looking at his hands. Marcus Reed, meanwhile, had been followed. He noticed it on a Tuesday evening, 2 nights after his courtroom testimony. He'd finished a late fare across town and was taking the long route back to the garage. A habit he'd developed over years of driving, taking different roads at night, partly out of boredom and partly out of something more instinctive. The same pair of headlights had appeared in his rearview mirror on 2 different roads that had no logical reason to share traffic. He turned twice, both times unnecessarily. The headlights turned with him. He drove to a gas station, be pulled under the fluorescent canopy and sat with the engine running. The headlights slowed and then continued past without stopping. He watched them in his mirror until they disappeared. He took out his phone and sent Ethan a message. "I think someone's watching me." Ethan called him back within 4 minutes. He told Marcus to document anything he noticed, to vary his routes, to avoid isolated areas, and to call the number Ethan gave him, a victim witness coordinator at the DA's office, if anything escalated beyond observation. He asked if Marcus had a safe place to stay for a few nights. Marcus said he had a cousin across the city. Ethan told him to consider using it. When he hung up, Ethan sat with the cold clarity of a man understanding what had just shifted. This was no longer just a case with missing evidence and a credibility dispute. Someone was trying to manage a witness. Someone had the resources and the motive to put eyes on a rideshare driver in the middle of the night. That level of active intimidation told him two things. Whoever was behind this was more exposed than Hayes alone could account for, and they were frightened enough to be making mistakes. Frightened people making mistakes was, in Ethan's experience, the most reliable engine of the truth eventually coming out. Alana received the news about the surveillance of Marcus without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction for anyone who knew how to read her. She listened to Ethan's summary on the phone, asked 3 precise questions, and then was quiet for a moment. "He's safe," she said. "He's being careful," Ethan said. "We're watching it." Another brief silence. "This isn't about the footage anymore, is it?" "It hasn't been about just the footage for a while," Ethan said. She exhaled slowly. "Then we need to find what they're actually trying to hide." She was right, and Ethan had already been thinking the same thing. The footage from the roadside stop was damaging to Hayes. It contradicted his version of events, it supported Alana's, and it raised serious questions about the initial stop. But it wasn't enough on its own to explain the level of active concealment that was now becoming visible. Review holds. Supervisor overrides. A witness being followed in the middle of the night. This machinery existed to protect something larger than one imperfect traffic stop. The system logs were where Ethan turned next. Like if the bodycam footage had been moved rather than deleted, if Lena was right, and he believed she was, then the movement itself would have left a trace. Every action taken in an evidence management system generated a log entry. Who accessed the file, when, from which terminal, and what action was taken. The logs themselves couldn't be deleted without leaving a record of the deletion. It was a closed system designed specifically to be auditable. Ethan filed a formal discovery request for the evidence management system logs related to the Hayes body cam footage. He filed it through the court, which meant it had to be responded to, and he filed it on a Friday afternoon, which meant whoever needed to prepare a response had the weekend to decide how honest that response was going to be. On Sunday evening, his phone rang. It was Lena Park. "The logs," she said. "Someone pulled them this afternoon, from inside the department." "Pulled them how?" "Accessed the system. They were looking at the same log entries you're going to be requesting. Whoever it is, they know the request is coming, and they wanted to see what the logs say before you do." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Do you know whose credentials were used to access them?" A pause. "The access was under a supervisor-level override, same tier as the original flag." She stopped. "Ethan, it's the same credential. The same person who flagged the footage is the one who just pulled the logs to see what's in them." And there it was. Not a name yet, but a shape. A single person operating above Hayes' level, moving in the dark, using administrative authority as a cover. Someone who had been protecting this since the night it happened, and who was now realizing that the protection was failing. Ethan called IA first thing Monday morning and shared what Lena had told him. He was careful about how much he disclosed regarding Lena specifically. She had not yet agreed to testify, and her safety depended on a degree of distance between her information and her identity. But the credential access logs were system records. They existed independent of any witness. If IA subpoenaed them, they'd see exactly what Lena had described. He could hear in the investigators' response that they already suspected something similar. The inquiry was no longer preliminary. The trial reconvened on a Monday morning that felt nothing like the previous sessions. The gallery was full in the particular dense way of a crowd that has been waiting for something and knows it is finally close. The reporters had shifted positions. Those nearest the door were angled toward it, anticipating a fast exit. Those in the center rows had their notebooks already open. Judge Barrow arrived precisely on time and settled into his chair with the expression of a man who has read every document submitted over the weekend and has formed views he intends to keep to himself for now. What had been a criminal trial had become something considerably more complicated. The assault charge against Alana was still technically the center of the proceeding, but the proceeding itself had expanded the way a room expands when you open a door you didn't know was there. Why, everyone in the building understood that the real subject of this trial was no longer one punch in a courtroom. It was the question of what the system had done and what it had hidden to make that punch feel, to a disciplined woman who had never acted without cause in her life, like the only available response. Captain Richard Lawson sat in the gallery for the first time. He had chosen a seat near the side wall, away from the press section, in the manner of a man who had decided that presence was less dangerous than absence, that being seen here was a form of control over the story. He was in civilian clothes. He sat with his arms resting on his knees and his face arranged into an expression of calm professional interest. Ethan noticed him the moment he walked in. He made a small notation, said nothing, and began arranging his materials. Hartwell opened by addressing the bodycam issue directly, a tactical decision that indicated his team had concluded the best defense was a proactive one. The footage was unavailable, he acknowledged, due to a sequence of evidence-handling steps that were under review. The review was ongoing. He asked the court not to infer from the absence of footage that the footage would have been exculpatory for the defense. Absence, he argued, was not evidence. Ethan rose. He agreed, he said, that absence alone was not evidence, but the manner in which the absence had been created might be. He requested that the court compel production of the evidence management system logs for the period beginning the night of the roadside stop. He had reason to believe those logs would reveal that the footage had been deliberately routed out of the standard evidence queue under a supervisor-level access credential, and that the same credential had accessed those logs again as recently as the previous Sunday. The courtroom shifted. Not loudly. A collective intake of breath, chairs adjusting, pens stopping mid-note. Judge Barrow looked at Hartwell. Hartwell looked at his co-counsel. A quiet exchange happened at that table that Ethan was too far away to hear, but the posture of both men told him enough. The judge compelled production of the logs. He gave a 2-hour turnaround. Court recessed. In the hallway outside, Ethan found Alana standing near a window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the street below. He came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How much longer?" she asked. "Today might be the day," he said, "or very close to it." She nodded slowly. She didn't look relieved. She looked the way she always looked, composed, present, carrying something heavy in a way that didn't show in her posture, but lived behind her eyes. "I've been thinking about what I said on the stand," she said, "about compliance and legitimate authority." "It landed," Ethan said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't trying to make a speech. I was just trying to explain what it actually was, what that night actually was." "That's exactly why it landed," he said. She turned back to the window. Down on the street, a small group of people stood on the sidewalk across from the courthouse, holding signs. From this distance, the words weren't legible. But she recognized the posture of people standing for something, and it did something to her that she hadn't expected, not comfort exactly, but the particular sensation of not being alone in a situation that had felt, for a long time, very solitary. Court reconvened with the logs. They were entered into evidence and placed on the display screen. Pages of system records, timestamps, credential codes, action descriptions. Dense and bureaucratic, the kind of document that was impenetrable without someone to explain it. Ethan had arranged for exactly that. A forensic evidence technician named Raymond Gibbs, hired independently, who took the stand and walked the court through the logs entry by entry. The footage had been flagged at 2:47 a.m. on the night of the stop. The flag was entered under credential designation SV14. By a supervisor-level access code, the footage moved from active evidence queue to a review hold at that same timestamp. 3 days later, the footage moved again, not to deletion, to a secondary archive partition designated for flagged items under long-term administrative review. That partition was accessed infrequently. Items in it did not generate automatic notifications when review periods lapsed. It was, Raymond Gibbs told the court, with the neutral tone of a man describing a filing cabinet, an effective place to put something you wanted to make difficult to find without officially destroying it. The second movement was also logged under credential SV14. And then, this past Sunday, 2 days ago, credential SV14 had accessed the log records themselves, accessed them, reviewed them, and exited without making any changes. And because changes to logs generated their own entries, and whoever was operating under that credential knew it. "Can you tell the court," Ethan asked, "to whom credential SV14 is assigned?" Raymond Gibbs looked at the document in front of him. According to the department's credential registry submitted this morning, SV14 is the assigned supervisor access credential of Captain Richard Lawson. The room did not erupt this time. It went in the opposite direction. Very, very quiet. Ethan let the quiet hold for 5 full seconds. Then he turned toward the gallery. Lawson had not moved. He sat with his arms on his knees and his expression carefully arranged, and he was looking directly at the front of the courtroom, not at Ethan, not at the screen, not at the logs. He was looking forward, and the effort of that was visible in the very stillness of it. Hartwell objected immediately. He raised the question of whether credential access could definitively prove the identity of the operator. Credentials could theoretically be shared, misused, stolen. He asked for latitude to respond fully to this development. Judge Barrow said he was granting that latitude. He was also, he said, directing the internal affairs investigators present in the building to treat the logs as material to their ongoing inquiry. He wanted a formal accounting of Captain Lawson's whereabouts and activities during the specific timestamps in question. He set a 24-hour deadline. Lawson stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He stood with the careful precision of a man who had decided that standing was still within the range of things he could control, even if very little else was. He said nothing. His attorney, a private attorney, Ethan noted, not a department-appointed one, was already moving toward him from the far side of the gallery. They exited together. The door swung shut behind them. The trial continued in their absence. Lena Park had agreed to testify. She arrived at the stand with the same quietly hunched posture she'd carried on the courthouse steps, the same careful economy of movement. But her voice, when she spoke, was steadier than Ethan had expected. She had made her decision, and she was going to finish making it. She described the evidence management system clearly, how flagging worked, what a review hold meant, what the secondary archive partition was, and how rarely it was accessed in normal operations. She described the night she had noticed the anomaly in the logs. A flag entered at an unusual hour under a supervisor credential for footage from an incident that was still active. She described the discomfort she'd felt, the days she'd spent deciding what to do about it. "Why did you come forward?" Ethan asked. Lena looked at her hands on the railing for a moment. "Because I kept thinking about what that footage was," she said. It wasn't evidence in a drug case or a robbery. It was footage of what happened to a specific person on a specific night, a person who was then charged with a crime. And I knew the footage existed, and I knew where it was going, and I knew that person didn't know any of that. She paused. Oh, that felt like something I couldn't just file and walk away from. She was composed under cross-examination. Hartwell questioned her technical knowledge, her access level, her ability to definitively interpret the log she had described. She answered each challenge without defensiveness and without overclaiming. She told the court exactly what she knew and exactly where the edge of what she knew was. That precision was its own kind of credibility. Hayes took the stand again late in the afternoon, under the revised circumstances. The Hartwell who had been confident and measured in the opening sessions had given way to a version that was technically still performing competence, but with the quality of a man managing a situation rather than controlling one. His questions to Hayes were tighter, more careful, designed to limit exposure rather than build a case. Hayes himself was not the same person who had taken the stand earlier. He was still in uniform. He was still physically composed, but the air around him had changed. The smirk that had characterized his early appearances in this building, the easy confidence of a man who expected the room to agree with him, was gone. What remained was effort. Visible, sustained effort to remain the man he'd decided to present as in a room that was now in possession of evidence that described a different man entirely. Under Ethan's cross-examination, Hayes was shorter in his answers, less elaborate. He had been advised by counsel, you could tell, to volunteer nothing. But saying less didn't repair what had already been said. His earlier testimony, the 7-minute gap, the guiding hand, of the statement that Alana had told him to stop, was in the record. It sat alongside the logs, the footage, and Lena's testimony like 4 walls of a room that was slowly becoming a very small space. When Ethan asked him whether he had any knowledge of the bodycam footage being flagged, Hayes said he did not. When Ethan asked whether he had ever communicated with Captain Lawson about the incident, Hayes said he had, in general terms, as part of normal supervisor check-ins. Did those check-ins include a phone call from the precinct parking lot approximately 30 minutes after you filed your incident report? A pause, the kind of pause that answered the question before the words did. I don't recall the specific timing of every communication I had that night. You don't recall, Ethan said. No, but you did call him. A beat. I may have. Ethan stepped back. No further questions. The afternoon ended with the case in a position that no one, not Hayes, not Lawson, not the department, not the union, had anticipated when it began. What had been designed to be a simple sealed story about an aggressive suspect and an officer doing his job had torn open in several places at once. The logs were in evidence. Lawson's credential was on record. The footage that was supposed to be invisible had been traced to a secondary archive, and its location was now a matter of official record. And a young woman from the evidence unit had stood in open court and described, calmly and precisely, the mechanism by which the truth had been made to disappear. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been moved. And now everyone knew exactly where to look. The anonymous message arrived at 11:43 p.m. Ethan was still at his desk when it came through. Same number as before, same stripped-down style. No greeting, no signature, just one sentence. You're looking in the wrong place. The footage was never destroyed. It was hidden. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the desk and sat with it. He had already known the footage hadn't been deleted. Lena had told him as much, and the logs had confirmed it. The secondary archive existed. The footage had been routed there. But knowing a destination and knowing how to reach it inside a department's internal evidence system were two very different things. He had filed the discovery request. He had compelled the logs. He had named the credential. But the footage itself was still somewhere inside a bureaucratic structure that had already demonstrated a willingness to obscure things that were inconvenient. The message was telling him something else, telling him the secondary archive wasn't the final resting place, or telling him how to get to it without waiting for the department to move at its own pace. He called Lena. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. He read her the message. There was a pause on her end. "The secondary archive isn't one location," she said slowly. "It's partitioned. Items flagged under supervisor level holds get routed into a sub-partition that's only accessible through the IA server network, not through the regular evidence terminals." Another pause. "I can't access it from my workstation. But under an active IA subpoena, their investigators can." "The subpoena is already filed," Ethan said. "Then they can get in," Lena said, "if they know to look in the sub-partition specifically, if they know the footage is there and not in the main archive." She stopped. "Does IA know to look there?" "They will by morning," Ethan said. He called the lead IA investigator at 7 the next morning before court resumed. He explained what he had, the message, Lena's clarification about the sub-partition, the technical pathway the footage would have taken when routed under a supervisor-level flag. The investigator listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, there was a brief silence. "We can execute on this today," the investigator said. "We'd need your evidence tech present to walk us through the partition structure." "She'll be there," Ethan said, and called Lena immediately after. She said yes before he finished explaining. She had made her decision days ago. Every step since then had simply been the continuation of that decision. Court recessed in the mid-morning to allow the IA retrieval attempt to proceed. Judge Barrow had authorized the recess with the particular economy of a man who understood what was being attempted and wanted it completed correctly rather than quickly. Both parties were informed. Hartwell objected on procedural grounds and was overruled. Hayes sat at his table during the recess with his attorney and said nothing audible to anyone around him. The retrieval team consisted of 2 IA investigators, Lena Park, and a department IT supervisor who had been formally seconded to the investigation under the terms of the subpoena. They worked in a secure terminal room on the second floor of the department building, 3 blocks from the courthouse. Ethan was not present. The room was restricted to authorized personnel, but Lena had agreed to call him the moment there was anything to report. The first 40 minutes produced nothing useful. The sub-partition existed, and they had accessed it, but it contained hundreds of flagged items spanning several years. Sorting by date narrowed the field significantly. Sorting by credential narrowed it further. SV-14 had routed 14 items into this partition over the past 3 years. Of those 14, 1 had been flagged on the specific night in question. Lena found it. She recognized the file designation. The format matched the bodycam equipment Hayes had been issued, and the timestamp on the file creation matched the night of the stop with a 40-minute offset, which was consistent with how the camera synced to the server. She notified the IT supervisor, who notified the lead IA investigator, who made 2 phone calls before authorizing the file to be opened. The footage was intact, not corrupted, not partial, complete. Every second from the moment Hayes switched the camera on to the moment he switched it off, unaltered, with the original timestamp embedded in the metadata. Whatever Lawson had been trying to protect, he had done it too carefully. He had moved the footage rather than destroyed it, perhaps because deletion would have left a cleaner record of intentional destruction. Perhaps because he had believed the subpartition was inaccessible enough to serve the same purpose. Whatever the reason, the footage existed, and now it was in the hands of investigators operating under a court-authorized subpoena. Lena called Ethan at 11:22 a.m. She said 3 words: "We found it." He was already gathering his jacket when he replied. The footage was authenticated under chain of custody protocols before it was brought to the courthouse. The IT supervisor generated a formal integrity report confirming the file had not been modified since its original creation. The IA investigators signed the transfer documentation. Every step was logged, witnessed, and time-stamped. Ethan had insisted on this. He understood that the footage's value was not just in what it showed, but in the unbreakable chain of evidence surrounding it. A defense attorney worth anything would attack the chain if the chain had any weakness. This chain had none. Court reconvened in the early afternoon. Ethan asked to present newly recovered evidence. He laid out the retrieval process, step by step. The anonymous tip, the subpartition, the IA investigators, Lena's technical guidance, the authentication report. He spoke without drama in the flat, sequential language of a man building something that needed to be structurally sound before it could bear weight. Judge Barrow listened. Hartwell objected twice. Both objections were overruled. The footage was admitted. Before it played, Ethan requested a brief recess. He used it to visit Alana in the conference room adjacent to the courtroom, or where she had been sitting with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He sat across from her. "We found it," he said. "It's going to play in the next session." Alana set both hands flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "Does it show what happened?" "All of it," he said. "Everything." She nodded once, slowly. Not with relief, with the expression of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, but hasn't done it yet because the motion of setting it down is still unfamiliar. "How bad is it for him?" she asked. "It's not good," Ethan said. "The footage shows him initiating everything, the approach, the escalation, the contact. There's no version of that footage that supports his account." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved around its business. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary motions of a day that had no particular weight for anyone who wasn't sitting in this room. "I want you to know something," she said. "I didn't come into this expecting the system to fix it. I've been in situations where the system was the problem. I know what that looks like. What I wanted, what I needed, was for the truth to be visible, for there to be a record." She paused. "Whatever happens with the verdict, at least there's a record now." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "There's going to be more than a record," he said. Hayes had chosen to remain in the courtroom for the afternoon session. His attorney had given him the option of stepping out. There was no procedural requirement for him to be present when the footage was presented. He had declined. Ethan noticed this and understood it. Hayes was still trying to control his image. Leaving would look like flight. He would stay and perform equanimity in front of the cameras and let his attorney handle the response. He did not fully understand what he was about to watch. The courtroom settled into a silence that was different from the silences that had preceded other significant moments in this trial. Those had been the silence of people waiting for something they half expected. This was the silence of a room holding its breath, because nobody was entirely sure what was on the other side. The footage began. Hayes' bodycam showed the night in the way that bodycam footage always did. Slightly tilted, slightly jostled, the particular perspective of a camera mounted on a chest rather than held by hands. The audio was clear. The highway sounds, the crunch of gravel on the shoulder, the approach to Alana's car. What the footage showed from the first minute was a stop that had no basis. Hayes did not state a reason for the stop on camera. He did not observe any infraction. He approached the vehicle, saw the driver, and his entire demeanor, audible in his voice, visible in his posture even from the tilted chest cam angle, shifted in a way that had nothing to do with traffic enforcement and everything to do with a decision already made about who this person was and what they deserved. The footage showed Alana announcing her reach into the glove compartment. It showed Hayes responding with a sharpness disproportionate to a cooperative driver performing a routine action. It showed 7 minutes of Hayes sitting in his cruiser running a plate that came back clean while Alana waited on the shoulder with both hands on the wheel. Then it showed him getting out of the cruiser, knowing the stop had no legal justification, and proceeding anyway. The questions with no procedural basis, the casual invasiveness of them, the way they were designed to feel like ordinary conversation while functioning as a pressure campaign. Alana's composed responses, every one of them. The order to exit the vehicle, Hayes' voice carrying no explanation, just command, just the naked expectation of compliance. And then, the physical contact. The footage was unambiguous. Hayes reached for Alana's arm with the deliberate motion of someone establishing dominance, not executing a procedure. He applied force. He twisted. And when Alana said, clearly, audibly, with perfect control, "Remove your hand, please," he increased the pressure. What followed lasted less than 3 seconds. Alana's release, Hayes going down, Alana stepping back with her hands raised. And then Hayes, getting up from the ground, already composing his face into the expression of a man who had just been assaulted. The footage continued for another 4 minutes. The backup arriving, Hayes speaking to them immediately, quickly, before anyone else established a version. His voice was measured and authoritative. He described resistance. He described escalation. He described Alana's actions in language that bore no relationship to what had happened 20 feet away from the camera that was recording all of it. When the footage ended, the courtroom remained in that held silence for a beat longer than felt natural. Then, one by one, sounds returned. The shift of a chair, a quiet exhale, a pen set down on a notepad. Hayes was looking at the screen. He was very still. The performance of equanimity he had maintained all afternoon had not shattered. It had simply become impossible to sustain without being visible as a performance, and he had stopped trying. What remained on his face was the expression of a man looking directly at something he cannot reframe, cannot manage, cannot contain. Just looking at it. 3 rows back in the gallery, a veteran in a jacket covered in service pins was looking at Hayes with an expression that required no translation. Ethan rose for his final argument. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the words corrupt or liar or racist, though the footage had made their absence more powerful than their presence would have been. He walked the court through a timeline, the stop with no stated cause, the 7-minute wait while a clean plate came back, the escalating questions, the physical contact, the defensive release, the immediate reshaping of the narrative before backup arrived. He laid beside it the actions that followed. The flag entered at 2:47 a.m., the footage routed to a sub-partition, the supervisor credential operating in the dark across 3 months. A witness followed in the middle of the night, and the logs accessed on a Sunday evening by the same credential that had started all of it. This, Ethan told the court, was not a case about one punch in a courtroom. It never had been. It was a case about what happens when a person who has served this country with distinction is treated as a problem to be managed rather than a citizen to be respected. And what happens when the system designed to provide accountability is used instead to manufacture a story. Sergeant Alana Brooks had not assaulted an officer. She had defended herself against a man who had made a decision about her on a dark highway before he ever reached her window. And she had done so with exactly the precision and restraint that 11 years of military service had built into her. And then she had sat in that courtroom and endured 3 months of a process that was supposed to find the truth while someone with a supervisor credential worked overtime to make the truth disappear. The truth had not disappeared. He sat down. Hartwell made his closing argument. It was competent. It was thorough. It acknowledged the footage's existence and attempted to reframe it. Hayes had been responding to an unpredictable situation. The footage showed an officer under stress making real-time decisions. Context was required to interpret behavior accurately. He argued that the evidence of tampering, while serious and worthy of separate investigation, should not be imported into the question of whether Hayes had been struck in a courtroom, which was the matter before the court. He was right that Hayes had been struck in a courtroom. He was asking the court to decide that it didn't matter how they got there. The room was not persuaded. Judge Barrow did not deliberate long. He had presided over this case from the beginning, and he had, over the course of its weeks, he formed a clear picture of what had happened and what the evidence established. He did not rush. The record needed to reflect a decision made carefully, not reactively. But he also did not let the record accumulate unnecessary weight. He had what he needed. Court reconvened the following morning at 9 o'clock. The gallery was at capacity before 8:30. The camera line outside had grown to nearly double its previous length. Reporters who had not been present for the earlier sessions had arrived for this one, drawn by the gravitational pull of a verdict that had become, in the days since the footage played, something larger than a single criminal proceeding. Ethan was at the defense table by 8:45. Alana arrived at 8:50 in her uniform and took her seat without looking around the room. Hayes was present. He sat at the prosecution's table in his uniform, which he was wearing for the last time as a free man, though he did not know that yet with certainty. He had the particular stillness of someone who has exhausted the available options and arrived at a place where the only remaining action is to wait. Judge Barrow entered at 9 precisely. He spoke for 11 minutes. He summarized the evidence clearly and without editorializing: the footage, the logs, the testimony, the forensic analysis, the authentication record. He noted the absence of any credible contradiction to the physical evidence presented. He noted the timeline of the footage's disappearance and what the system logs established about how and when and under whose credential it had been moved. He noted that the prosecution's assertion that the tampering evidence should be considered separately from the assault charge was procedurally coherent but practically untenable, because the tampering evidence was directly probative of whether the assault had been accurately characterized by the person making the charge. And then he said the words: "All charges against Sergeant Alana Brooks were dismissed, not reduced, not deferred. Dismissed with a formal finding that the prosecution had been predicated on a misrepresentation of the underlying events and had been supported by evidence that had been deliberately withheld." Alana did not react immediately. She sat at the defense table and listened to the judge complete his statement. And when he finished, she placed both hands flat on the table in front of her, the same hands that had been folded there through every session of this trial, and held them there for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly through her nose. A single, controlled breath. Ethan, beside her, put his pen down. He'd been taking notes out of habit and had stopped mid-sentence when the judge said, "Dismissed." He looked at Alana. She was looking straight ahead. "It's over," he said quietly. She nodded once, but she didn't move immediately, and he understood why. When you have been holding something for months, the discipline of it, the weight of staying composed when every instinct said otherwise, the daily practice of not letting the injustice of it break through. The release doesn't come all at once. It comes the way pressure equalizes slowly, through a process, not an event. The room had come to life around her. The gallery was in motion. Reporters were already moving toward exits, phones to ears, the machinery of the news cycle spinning up. Someone near the back let out a sound, not quite a cheer, something more complicated than that. Two veterans near the sidewall exchanged a look that carried a full conversation in it. Hayes was taken into custody before he reached the courthouse door. It was not a dramatic arrest. Two officers approached him in the corridor outside the courtroom, officers he had never met from outside his division, which was itself a deliberate choice. And they spoke to him briefly and quietly, and Hayes looked at the document they presented him with, and then he went with them. He didn't resist. He didn't say anything audible. So he walked between them through the corridor and out of the building, and the cameras on the sidewalk captured him in the flat mid-morning light, and whatever expression was on his face in those photographs would be the one that people remembered. Captain Richard Lawson had not been present in the courtroom that morning. He had, through his private attorney, entered a no-contest statement on the evidence tampering charge 2 hours before the verdict was read. The statement was careful and minimal. It acknowledged the credential access, accepted procedural responsibility for the misrouting of evidence, and made no admissions beyond the narrow technical facts. His attorney had clearly advised him to concede the smallest possible ground. It wouldn't be enough. The IA investigation had continued while the trial concluded, and what it had uncovered extended well beyond a credential access log. Lawson's suspension had been announced the previous afternoon. The formal investigation into the full scope of his involvement was ongoing, and the evidence being gathered suggested that the Hayes case was not the first time SV-14 had been used to make a problem disappear. The complaints that had been withdrawn, the witnesses who had reconsidered, the reports that had been closed without action. The thread that Ethan had circled in his notes on the first day of his investigation, who spoke to the complainants, was being pulled, and the more it was pulled, the more it unraveled. Alana did not watch Hayes being taken from the building. She was still inside in the conference room adjacent to the courtroom when it happened. She was sitting across from her mother. She, who had arrived that morning from across the city and had not said very much since the verdict was read. They were sitting close together, and her mother was holding both of Alana's hands in both of hers, and neither of them was talking. Ethan knocked and put his head through the door. He looked at the two of them and decided that whatever he needed to tell Alana could wait another 20 minutes. He pulled the door closed quietly. Outside the courthouse, the veterans who had been standing on the steps began to drift away in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who have seen something through to its conclusion. A few of them lingered on the sidewalk, talking quietly with each other in the way that people talk when they have been through something together without quite being in the same room for it. But Colonel Victor Ramsey was not among them. He had not come to the courthouse. He had followed the proceedings from a distance, through the channels available to him, and when the verdict came through, he was in his office on base, reading the summary on his laptop. He closed it after a minute, sat back, and allowed himself one quiet exhale before his next meeting. He would write Alana a letter, an actual letter, not an email, that evening. He had already drafted it in his head. It was not long, and it did not say very much because the things it needed to say didn't require many words. Marcus Reed was in his car on the other side of the city when his phone notified him of the verdict. He had a fare in the back seat, a man in his 40s who was talking on his own phone and not paying attention to Marcus at all. Marcus read the notification at a red light. He set the phone down on the console and drove the rest of the route without saying anything. When he dropped the fare and was alone in the car again, he sat for a moment in the parking lot of a strip mall and looked at his phone on the console. He thought about the 43 seconds he had almost deleted 3 months ago. He thought about the courthouse steps and how cold it had been that morning when he'd walked in to testify. He thought about Alana standing on a highway shoulder in the middle of the night, hands raised, doing everything right. He picked up the phone and called his sister because he needed to tell somebody. The weeks that followed moved with the particular pace of institutional change, which is to say, slowly and imperfectly, but forward. But policy reviews were initiated within the department. The evidence management system's sub-partition was restructured under new oversight protocols. Access to it now required dual authorization and generated automatic notifications to the chief's office. The supervisor credential system was audited, and 4 other credential holders were identified for review of their access histories. 3 of Hayes' prior complaint cases were reopened. 2 of the witnesses who had originally withdrawn their statements agreed to speak again. The picture that emerged was consistent with the pattern Ethan had circled on his first day with the file, a man who had operated with the confidence of someone who believed the system would protect him because until now it reliably had. The union's public support for Hayes dissolved in stages. first quietly, then officially and finally with a statement that acknowledged the evidence and expressed commitment to accountability, which was the kind of language organizations produced when the alternative was worse. Some of its members were grateful for the statement. Others were not. The internal reckoning that followed was the kind that took years rather than weeks, and nobody pretended otherwise. Ethan received a letter from the state bar 3 weeks after the verdict. It was not a complaint. It was a commendation, the first he had received in 7 years as a public defender, which struck him as both overdue and exactly right. He put it in his desk drawer and went back to the file he was working on, which was a different case with a different client who was also depending on someone to keep looking past the easy version of the story. 6 weeks after the dismissal, on a Tuesday morning in late December, Alana Brooks stood in a gymnasium on a Marine Corps base and watched a group of new recruits moving through a training circuit. She was there in an advisory capacity, a temporary assignment she had requested specifically because she needed time to do something with her hands and her mind before deciding what came next. The recruits were young, earnest, occasionally awkward in the particular way of people who are trying to meet a standard they don't yet fully understand. She watched them without speaking for a while. One of the instructors noticed her and started to say something, probably to introduce her, probably to make something of the medals on her chest. And she gave him a look that said, "Not necessary," and he read it correctly and went back to the circuit. She was not thinking about the courtroom. She was not thinking about the footage or the logs or the secondary archive. She was not thinking about Hayes' face when the footage played, or Lawson's careful exit through the gallery doors, or the sound the gavel made when the judge called order on the day it began. She was thinking about the young woman on her left, third position in the circuit, who was running the drill wrong, her weight back when it should have been forward, and who was going to hurt herself if nobody corrected it. Alana walked over quietly and positioned herself beside the recruit and demonstrated the correct weight distribution without comment. The recruit adjusted, ran it again, got it right. Alana watched her go and felt the small, clean satisfaction of a thing done correctly. It was not a feeling that required any particular reflection. It was just what it was, simple and solid and entirely sufficient. The kind of feeling that didn't need to be explained to anyone or remembered in any particular way. It was enough to just be here, doing the next useful thing in the life she had fought to keep. If the system meant to protect us can be turned against us so easily, what does justice actually mean, and who does it really serve? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that need to be heard.